What funny or awkward situations have you found yourself in because of knowing more than one language? One time I was in Mexico with my girlfriend who speaks Spanish. We were walking around and I overheard a group of people gossiping about me, thinking I wouldn't understand. They were saying, "He's cute, but I bet he's so full of himself." I just casually walked up to them and said, "I totally agree. I am pretty awesome." The shocked expressions on their faces were worth it. My girlfriend looked at me in disbelief, but I couldn't help but laugh at how I caught them red-handed. Once, while I was in Italy, I heard a couple behind me on the bus talking about how strange my accent sounded when I spoke Italian. They didn't know that I could understand them, and they were mocking me for how bad my Italian was. So I turned around and said, "I think my accent is way more charming than your inability to speak proper English." They were speechless, and I just smiled as they realized they had been talking about me the whole time. I was in Paris with my friend who speaks French, and we were at a cafe. The waiter didn't speak much English, and I wanted to order a coffee, so I tried my best French and said, "Un café, s'il vous plaît." However, I didn't realize that I had accidentally said, "Un café, s'il vous plaît." Please, a cockroach. The waiter looked at me puzzled, and I tried to fix it, but he just chuckled and said, "Are you sure?" My friend was in on the joke and didn't say anything, so I had to drink my coffee with a huge blush on my face. One time, while in Greece, I was talking to some locals in Greek, and I overheard a couple of tourists talking about how they didn't believe I was a tourist because I spoke such good Greek. They were saying I must be faking it. So I turned around and said in Greek, "You guys speak worse Greek than I do, and you're the tourists." They looked at me like they had just been caught doing something illegal, and I couldn't help but laugh at their reactions. I was in Spain with a friend of mine who speaks Spanish. We were walking down the street when a group of people started gossiping about how my friend was too nice to me, even though they didn't know me at all. They were talking about how they thought I was using my friend. So I turned around and said, "If I was using her, I'd probably be wearing better shoes." The group fell silent, and I walked away laughing, leaving my friend shaking her head. I was at a party in the US with some friends who were all speaking Spanish, and I was just sitting there, enjoying the conversation. I didn't think anyone would notice that I understood everything they were saying. But then, one of my friends said, "She's so quiet, I bet she's just pretending to understand us." They all laughed, and I just smiled back. Later, when they were talking about how bad my fashion sense was in Spanish, I turned to them and said, "Yeah, I heard everything, and by the way, my style is way better than all of yours combined." They were stunned, and I just walked away, leaving them to look at each other in confusion. I was in Japan visiting some friends, and I overheard a group of students talking about how cool my shoes were. They were discussing how expensive they must be, but they were calling them ridiculous. I didn't think much of it, but I decided to casually join the conversation and said in perfect Japanese, "Yes, they are pretty expensive, and you wouldn't be able to afford them with your budget." They went silent, and I could see them blush as they realized I understood everything. I was in Berlin visiting some old friends. They're all German, and we were speaking in German, but I could hear them discussing my accent when I wasn't speaking. I knew they were talking about me because I heard words like schwer and komisch. They said I sounded funny, so I turned around and started speaking perfect German, throwing in some advanced vocabulary, and said, "I guess my accent is so weird that I can't even hear your bad grammar." The look on their faces was absolutely priceless. They were floored. Once, I was at a wedding in Germany, and I overheard a group of older women talking about how awkward it was that I was dancing. They thought I didn't understand German, so they were saying all sorts of things about my moves. Well, I turned around and in fluent German said, "I may be awkward, but at least I'm not a grandma who needs a walker to dance." The room went silent, and I could see everyone trying to hold back their laughter. I was at a Chinese restaurant in New York, and I overheard the staff talking about me in Mandarin, assuming I didn't understand a word. They were discussing how I looked like I didn't belong in the place, and how I seemed out of place. But then I turned to the waiter and said, "Yes, I am a foreigner, but I do love your dumplings." Their faces went pale, and they were so embarrassed. I knew they were just joking, but it was hilarious to watch them scramble to apologize. I was in a Russian cafe in New York, and I overheard a group of Russians making fun of my accent. They didn't know I spoke fluent Russian, so they were joking about how terrible my Russian was. Without missing a beat, I turned to them and said, "If my Russian is terrible, then your English is absolutely atrocious." They were so shocked, and it was hilarious watching them try to recover. Once, I was visiting my girlfriend's family in the US. She's Polish, and I speak both Polish and English. While we were having dinner, her younger sister started commenting on how cute I looked, and I didn't think much of it. But then her sister looked at me and asked in Polish if I was flirting with her. I knew exactly what she said, but to her surprise, I answered back in Polish, "It's very flattering." She turned bright red, not expecting me to understand. The look on her face was priceless, and I couldn't stop laughing. One time, while in France, I was sitting at a cafe, and a couple next to me started discussing a very personal topic in Russian, assuming no one around understood them. They were debating whether or not to stay together and started listing each other's faults, right there in public. I couldn't help but listen. When they were done, I leaned over and said in Russian, "You guys are actually kind of cute together." Their jaws dropped, and they left without even paying their bill. At a Turkish market, a vendor was telling his colleague in Turkish that he could easily overcharge me because I looked clueless. I turned to him, smiled, and said in Turkish, "Actually, I know exactly how much this should cost." He tried to laugh it off, but I ended up getting a discount just for the shock factor. One day in a Brazilian bar, I overheard two tourists talking about me in Portuguese, trying to guess if I was single and discussing my dateability. I decided to mess with them a bit and turned to them, saying in Portuguese, "Just to answer your question, yes, I am single, and no, I don't have time for you." They laughed and offered to buy me a drink as a truce. Once, I was on a train in Italy, and a group of older men started talking about the stupid tourist, me, who clearly looked like he had no clue where he was going. They debated whether to give me directions just for fun, all in Italian. After a few minutes, I turned to them and said in Italian, "Actually, I'm just going to the next stop." They laughed so hard, realizing their joke had backfired, and offered me wine as an apology. I was in an elevator in Dubai, and a couple started talking about my weird outfit in French. They were discussing how I obviously didn't know how to dress. When the elevator doors opened, I smiled at them and said in French, "Thanks for the fashion advice." They were so embarrassed that they actually apologized before hurrying away. I was visiting a friend in Argentina, and we went to a small family gathering. Her grandmother, who thought I only spoke English, whispered to her, "Why is your friend so thin? Are they feeding him back home?" I turned to her and replied in Spanish, "Don't worry, I'm being fed very well, thank you." She laughed so hard that she made me promise to call her abuela from then on. I was in Greece with some friends, and one of them made a very detailed comment about a girl he saw in Greek, assuming she wouldn't understand. She turned around and replied with a witty comeback in perfect Greek, completely shutting him down. We laughed for days, and he never made assumptions like that again. While working in an office in Japan, my co-worker assumed I couldn't speak Japanese, so they often muttered things under their breath about me. One day, I overheard them saying how I was a slacker and barely doing anything. I turned around, looked them in the eye, and said in Japanese, "I'd be more productive if someone wasn't distracting me with commentary." The entire office went silent, and my co-worker apologized immediately. While waiting in line at a bakery in Montreal, a couple in front of me started gossiping about me in French, saying I didn't look like I could afford anything fancy, and was probably just window shopping. When it was my turn to order, I placed my order in fluent French and even tipped extra. The look on their faces was priceless, and I hope it taught them a lesson. I was working in a cafe in Germany, and a group of American tourists came in. They were clearly making fun of the coffee options in English, mocking the names. They thought no one could understand them. When I took their order, I added in perfect English, "Oh, and you'll love our too fancy macchiato." They turned red, laughed it off, and tipped me extra. I guess they learned not to underestimate the staff. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these hilarious multilingual moments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own funny stories in the comments below. What awkward or funny language situations have you experienced? We'd love to hear them and maybe even feature them in our next video.